Welcome everyone to another episode of what we are calling the Pan Levant podcast. I'm Hayana Madi, and here's your co-host Elijah Kallenberg,
Hello,
and
hello.
yeah, we are actually in the presence of Syrian royalty, if you will. Paul here is part of
Boo.
part of the Al-Jundi family, I guess. And you
Yeah.
can explain to us a little bit about that. But basically, yeah, you and I just met like a couple of years ago on TikTok. We've made a interview in the past. We've had an episode in the past, and it's nice to catch up with you again. And I'm excited to talk about like everything that's all the developments that have been going on since we've last spoken, and excited to flesh out like your thoughts on it. And actually, so I'm a Syrian Muslim. We got a Syrian Jew in my left on my left here, and we've got a descendant of Syrian Christians. So we've got a nice
Check
little
off that box.
yeah, so it gives a nice zebra, pancake, whatever ethnic,
Amazing.
religious mishmash
Hey, we're not
around
called
the
the
table.
Pantheon podcast for nothing. We're living
Exactly.
it here.
This is
Yeah,
what the goal is to try to get a lot of intersectionality discussions with, people of all kinds and that come from the Levant, and hopefully advance the cause for a united Levant someday. Um,
inshallah.
but yeah, so I remember like describe your content to us, Paul, if you can, please. And also, yeah, if you can give us like the history of your family in Syria and stuff like that, and what I meant by political royalty and why you what you mean by boo. I mean I thought I just mean like I'm genuinely I admire like your grandparents' history and stuff, but I'll let you
No,
explain.
no, it's a facetious boo. I'm not,
Okay.
it's fine. It's fine. That just just makes it sound like I'm like some friggin' prince or something. No, yeah, so my content is, I don't know, it evolves. It's not the same now as the last time we talked, but I
Mhm.
mean, originally I think I got connected to a bunch of online Arab creators because I just talked about Arab history, Islamic history, North Africa, Southeast Asia. I did a big series on the Islamic Golden Age, as it's called, the medieval caliphate era, where there was kind of the connective tissue between kind of like old Greco-Roman Enlightenment and then like the Italian, Western European Enlightenment, that kind of thing. And so I gained some notoriety there, and uh, then when Palestine became prominent in the news, I pretty much switched and talked about nothing but that for a year and a half. And then last December, I've been focusing a little more. I'm not posting as consistently as I used to these days, but I still post pretty frequently. Nowadays, I kind of talk a lot about Syria, and I have a YouTube series called Start Here Palestine, and then a little mini series I'm working on called Start Here Syria. I'm just trying to give background and longer form content, and that's pretty much my content. My family, so I'm trying to get better at explaining this because I've never been able to tell people what my family is with regardless of who they are, where they're from, Syrians, they're always
Mhm.
like, I don't understand. So this is so in terms of who we are, that's very straightforward. The Jindi family, very prominently in Salamieh, which is kind of like in the region of Hama and Homs and all that. And we
Mhm.
have a bunch of relatives in Masyaf and all that. And the Al-Jundis was so I had relatives who were in Salah Hadid's government, which was just prior to the Assad takeover, and my grandfather Ali Jundi was a very prominent free verse Arabic language poet, kind of like a hip, we're rejecting form and structure poet
Yeah.
guy in the 60s and 70s. He was kind of very well known among those kind of circles, and um, big in France, that kind of thing. So uh, he was my grandfather, and who was, in terms of his background on his side, they were Ismaili Muslim,
Wow.
and and his father either I've never been able to get a straight answer about quite how prominent he was, but he was part of
Mhm.
the elder council in Salamieh. He
Hmm.
might have been the head of it or very close to it or something. So he
Mhm.
was like a big guy in the Al-Jundi family and the
Uh,
clan and Salome and stuff. But when my Jiddo got kind of uh, hip and modern and a little commie,
yeah.
he rejected religion pretty much wholesale and married my teta, my grandmother, who is a Protestant Christian from Saadad,
Hmm.
Wow.
near Homs. So because of that, I'm basically Syrian Christian through my teta's
Hmm.
side,
Hmm.
Mm.
because she raised her whole family Christian,
I see. I
and
see.
she was raised Christian, and my mom raised me Christian in America with my dad. My American grandfather is a Methodist preacher, so
I see.
we're the that and that's the Tawil family, who is a very, very like
Oh, okay.
ancient, goes all the way back in the
Nice.
Levant.
Can I just ask real
They were,
quick?
yeah.
A lot of people in our audience are probably unfamiliar with the fact that there were Protestant Christians in the Levant. I mean, maybe they
Mm.
knew that Palestine, there is a significant Protestant clergy present in Jerusalem and other holy cities. But can you speak a little about how in Syria the Protestant Christian sects came to be? I think most people would assume that Orthodoxy,
Mm.
Catholicism is the
Yeah,
majority. How did Protestants get there in the first place?
great question. It's weird, but essentially in that kind of region, in those mountains there, there were a fair amount of Syrian Christians already, most of whom were Greek Orthodox.
Yep.
But relatively recently, so probably around the 1800s or whatever, um, Americans, Europeans, some Spanish, some of those basically other type of Europeans, especially, were coming in through Lebanon.
Hmm.
And as they came in through Lebanon, different types of Christians would come through. Particularly, there were a lot of kind of proselytizing Protestants. One
Hmm.
of those groups were the Presbyterians, who were associated with establishing the AUB in Lebanon, the American University of Beirut.
Oh,
And I don't that's the extent of all I know, but I know that at some point those Presbyterian Christians made it into the Syrian mountains and were essentially like, hey, who wants like a college degree?
Yeah.
nice.
Would you how and if so, how would you feel about, I'm probably oversimplifying it, but basically
Right.
it was like, they
Interesting.
so a bunch of Greek Orthodox Syrians in the 1800s uh, converted to technically
Wow.
Presbyterian, but really didn't care. There aren't enough Presbyterians, or sorry, Protestants in Syria to have like further denominations
Right.
of Protestant.
I
So
see.
there's just this little Protestant group of Syrians in
Wow.
in like in like kind of in the mountains near the coast, and that's where my
Fascinating.
teta comes from. So she was definitely Greek, or her family at least was Greek Orthodox at some point, and then they were converted in the 1800s to Protestant.
Nice.
Wow. Absolutely
Yeah,
fascinating. It and
yeah.
if it's okay with everyone, you mentioned in your content that you're posting a lot about Palestine, and so
Mm.
obviously in the news, Israeli aggression is at the forefront. The ceasefire has collapsed unilaterally because of Israel's decisions. Israel is intentionally trying to siphon off Syrian land any chance they get. Can you speak a little bit about what Israeli policy is at this moment? Because it seems like at every front they're trying to poke the bear, whether it be HTS and
Hold
Syria,
on, bro.
whether it
Could
be
I?
in Gaza. Yeah, they're trying to poke everyone. So can you speak a little to our audience about what's going on in Gaza and Syria at this moment, and what is Israel's policy in general? Is this strategic? Is it not strategic? What is their end goal here?
Before that, though, if it's possible, I just wanted to ask a little bit more about your family, though. Like,
Sure.
yeah, we can still talk about Israel in a minute, but I was just wondering, like, yeah, I remember like as part of one of your videos, like on Start Here Syria, I think you mentioned like your grandfather was part of the Damascus Spring, and he was one of the
Mhm.
Wow.
signatories of the what was it, the declaration? Could you
Yeah, the
talk more about that?
the state the statement of 99. Yeah, he's
Wow.
I want to say he's number 94, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah,
Um,
it's still very noteworthy and something like I'd love if you could speak about some more.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, it pertains to your question, Elijah,
Hmm.
because I mean, you can eventually go back to Damascus Spring and when Hafez died, and it all kind of relates to the geopolitics of the region for
Of
sure.
course, yeah.
But basically, so my grandfather, he had to flee to Lebanon for a while, but after, yeah, Bashar, sorry, after Hafez basically kind of established himself and things cooled down, he was allowed to come back
Hmm.
later in his life. And he was kind of just like a prominent voice there, and he would still do poetry and readings and that kind of
Hmm.
stuff and interviews, and he was still pretty well connected to like the arts community of Syria. So
Hmm.
the statement of 99
Hmm.
was organized when it was organized right after Hafez's death
Hmm.
in the year 2000. I think it was right in the year 2000.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's right.
I think
Yeah.
so.
And they basically gathered a bunch of intellectuals, and so my grandfather, I think, was personal friends with one of the main organizers, who's like a filmmaker,
Amazing.
whose name I forget. But
Mm.
yeah, he was very actively part of that, and was basically saying you know, eventually he said this, 20, or whatever, 11 years before it became relevant. But he basically said, you can either, uh, engage in reform now,
Hmm.
or you can engage in a very long civil war that will happen one way or the other. Eventually, you're going to lose your throne one way or the other.
Yeah.
And he died in, I think, 2000. I want to say 2007,
Hmm.
2008. That's nice, something like that. And so he just a couple of years more, he would have seen that his
Wow.
prediction was correct.
Wow.
But he really is a well-known figure among those things. And Damascus Spring was about a year and a half, I guess, of a glimmer of hope before
Yeah.
Bashar finally was just like, actually, no, I'm just like
Just
my
gonna
dad, maybe
arrest
worse.
everyone and yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
And I remember I recently like came across a headline or not headline, like people are chattering about the community in Salamiyah. Actually, I didn't know that the Aga Khan that like recently passed
Mm.
away. I didn't know he had any influence over Ismailis in Syria, but apparently he played a role in asking them to lay down their weapons during the do you know anything about
Wow.
that? Like during the storming of Damascus in December 8th?
So I heard about this.
Okay.
So the Ismailis in Syria. So I actually don't know the extent to which there are still like actual Nizari Ismailis. For the most
Hmm.
part, I think of
Hmm.
it as like the ethnicity of the Syrians
Right.
there, and
Okay.
because my mom moved to Damascus when she was like 3 years old or something,
Hmm.
we only visited Salamiyah. We didn't usually
Okay.
stay there.
All right.
So
Hmm.
I couldn't tell you how, and the last time that I went was before the Civil War. I couldn't go after the Civil War. So
Mm.
I couldn't tell you exactly how much influence really exists there
Yeah,
and how much they just want to say there is,
I
just to
see.
kind of
Okay.
like keep up appearances.
Right. Because he is very much
Yeah,
that appearance. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So when my grandfather decided to modernize and to not be religious in his
Hmm.
lifestyle, at that point, they had already kind of dropped the Aga Khan,
Okay, I
like
see.
somewhere around when the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, like
Oh
really
well.
way back. So
Okay.
Yeah.
they at that point already sort of didn't care, and it was very monetary. It was just a monetary thing.
It is,
The
yeah,
Aga
it's a
Khan
little exploitative in
immediate
my opinion. Like,
yeah, yeah. They kept
Yeah.
they were broke at that point. They knew the empire was collapsing, and so they kept on trying to collect more and more money from
yeah,
anybody around that they could get money from. And so a lot of the Muslims in Salamia were like, no.
good, yeah,
And
honestly.
just like that, the Aga Khan became less and less relevant.
I
But there's
see.
definitely still some like actual Nizari practicing Nizari Sunni there,
I see.
and they of course definitely still listen to the Aga Khan. So the Aga Khan they will have communication there. Aga
Hmm.
Khan, whatever he said, I actually have no idea
Right, right. Yeah, I
what
was just
what might
chattering
have
like
transpired there.
I didn't pull up any um specific news about that. But yeah, sorry to divert that. I just wanted to just get a little bit
No,
more lore about Salamia and your grandfather out there.
yeah,
But
sure. I
yeah,
mean, I'm sure they called him, and he was like, "Yeah, don't fight." And they were like, "Great, we're not gonna anyway."
nice.
Like it's very famously, Salamina did kind of harbor with the Free Syrian Army in the first couple of years, but
Right.
as
Hmm.
soon as it kind of fell apart and became more sectarian, they were very hands off, and just
Mm.
geographically, for the most part, they were able to do that without because they're kind of a little bit out of the way. So
Sweet.
they weren't super involved one way or the other after like 2013, 2014 or something. So
Yeah, yeah, I see.
yeah.
Okay. And sorry, so Elijah, your question was what is Israeli policy
So
right now? They're just
you, yeah,
poking the bear.
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
Just what the heck is
So
Israel thinking right now? Because it seems like on every front they're wanting to poke the bear. So if you can enlighten our audience, that would be grateful.
well, and no one can. I mean, that's open for discussion. I think that the real discussion based around that is to what extent we know for a fact that there's just internal politic happening in in apartheid Israel
Yes.
regarding Netanyahu's corruption trial, right? Like if they're in a state of war, then the trial gets canceled, and so he just did that,
Also,
nonsense again.
I think he fired the head of maybe the Shin Bet or one of the intelligence agencies as part of the attempt to get Ben Gvir back in his coalition. And that
Hmm.
individual had a lot of oversight on his corruption trial. And so definitely some nefarious activity going on there, 100%.
Yeah, exactly. And so internally, there's that's the argument there is, to what extent is that enough of an explanation? Most people would say not entirely. So also in terms of like the regional politics and posturing and stuff, there's also just like the wartime nationalism and stuff that they're so freakish for. But then in addition to that, why do they keep on goading everybody so much in the region when most analysts would agree that their position continues to weaken? So that's up for discussion. I mean, I think that obviously the thing that they've always been most obsessed with, kind of the habit of them, is to posture as more and more cruel, more and more strong, and that's partly just to kind of bring in more settlers, because that's what it's all about. Is just more and more and more and more settlers all the time, forever. But it's also a corruption and greed thing in terms of, the more people they attack, the more war funding they get, and the people who are in control of these things generally tend to prioritize that over, say, the lives of Israeli hostages. Like, they just don't care. So finally, you've kind of had this terrifying fall of Syria in terms of the Zionist position, because that it greatly weakens Iran and hugely weakens Turkey, which uh, is not good for Zionism, basically, in most cases. I mean, obviously, there's been a little bit of, we know that there's like a capitalistic sort of relationship between Turkey and Israel. Like, there's no secret
Hmm.
about that at this point.
Energy
But
sharing.
Yeah.
right, all that stuff. So it's not like some huge, enemy thing, but
Right.
and Turkey is obviously aligned with the US, which makes things more complicated. But there's no other way to sugarcoat the fact that Zionism is hurt by the a Syria that is not that just spent 14 years fighting with Iran, right? So now Iran doesn't have that strength in Syria that they used to have. Hezbollah, it doesn't have that distraction, and then there's all this funding and supply lines and all that stuff, but not talk. And their their knee-jerk reaction is always going to be to destabilize, destabilize, destabilize.
Heck yeah.
And I really just think that they don't feel like they have anything else to do, and especially the fact that they internally benefit from this, like in a
Oh yeah.
political sense. Why wouldn't they? What do
Exactly.
they have? What do they have to lose at this point? What are they
For
going to do?
sure.
Like, oh, like, say we lost and then stop attacking people? No, it's not their way. So
I think
that's how I receive it. But I am definitely open to
for
people
sure.
who
And that's
disagree
like
with
that.
points of
No,
that,
that's
because
nothing
yeah.
objectionable said there. And I think the three biggest players right now that just benefit like the most off of just chaos in the region, and I think are behind like these clashes in Lebanese Syrian borderlands that you're seeing, like are that are mostly being incited online, in my opinion. Like people are seeing stuff online and then they're going out and they're having reactions to stuff that they like. I think there's a lot of incitement going on either side, and it's promoted by Iran, Israel, and Russia. Like there have been people like analyzing traffic on Twitter and stuff like that, and
Mm,
they'll do like data maps and stuff like that, and they'll analyze the source of it. And those three countries have come up prominently as like trying to sabotage like the information wave with um with just flooding of just any negative or fear inciting sort of sentiment about the new Syrian government, you know?
mm.
What three
Yeah,
countries
I
would you
saw
say?
that.
Yeah. Hi, on.
Go,
Would you say
go ahead.
it's Israel, Iran, and Russia? Is that who you're
Yeah,
going
yeah, that's
for?
what I'm saying. Those are the three most prominent that are trying to influence like the outcome of what's going on in Syria, and I think they're about like a lot of it is they're behind like the borderlands clashes between Lebanon and Syria, where you're seeing like um, Hezbollah and the new Syrian army just going at it back and forth, arresting smugglers and drug traffickers, and then getting accused of attacking civilians or sheep herders or stuff like that, and then like people will be outraged about that and then retaliate. And The Lebanese army has in some cases stepped in to rein in Hezbollah and to coordinate with the new Syrian army, and that's what I'm hoping to see more of that kind of cooperation, to be honest, because for a long time like the Lebanese state was held hostage to Hezbollah, but I think with like Nasrallah gone, they're probably at their weakest right now. So I don't know. I don't know. Maybe you could speak to that as well, Paul, or you, Elijah. Like Lebanese Syrian cooperation. Like I wish we could be stepped up to fight Hezbollah, even though like a lot of Axis supporters might prefer that everyone just focus on Israel all the time. Like I think it would be a good first test to kind of try to root out Hezbollah from Lebanon, like from with Syrian Lebanese cooperation to kind of like develop those kinds of uh, ties, and then to hopefully like strengthen our own military capabilities so that and legitimate military capabilities, not like a militia or a state within a state like Hezbollah does, which in my opinion like can only go so far when Iran is like holding a lot of the cards and it's far away, and it'll kind of sacrifice Gaza, it'll sacrifice Lebanon, it'll sacrifice Syria before it
Hmm.
engages in a war with Israel on its own.
Yeah, I think you're hitting at the core of the controversy, and it's where should the government's priorities lie at this moment? Because I think much of the backlash was the fact that Israel's siphoning off land in the south. There's really not all that much pushback we can see at this point. But for Hezbollah, there is a bigger impetus. So, Paul, do you think that critique is valid, or is there a strategic priority why the government priorities are currently on Hezbollah and there's more of a restrained reaction towards Israel's actions?
Yeah, I mean, so nobody knows exactly what they're thinking. I mean, first of all, I think that Hezbollah is a bigger threat. I know that that sounds a little weird, but obviously everybody wants any sort of occupation to leave the Southwest.
Yeah.
But I think that I guess the way that I would say it is there's nothing to do with Hezbollah other than just to fight or work with Lebanon. Do you know what
Hmm.
I mean? Like that's pretty much all
Yeah.
there is. And they have a lot of experience fighting Hezbollah,
Mm,
and they have the advantage of being able to prevent Iran to get to Hezbollah, like
mm,
strategically
Hmm.
right now. So they're in a much more advantageous position. And honestly, you know, as much as all Syrians, hate Zionism and Israel,
mm,
Israel was not nearly as much of a major player, if at all, in the Syrian revolution as Hezbollah was. Hezbollah was a decisive party
mm.
for quite a lot of the battles and the source of just no comparison, the amount of
Yeah,
brutality
Yeah.
from Hezbollah towards Syrian opposition to the regime compared to Israel, right? So Israel had almost nothing to do with anything except for a little strip along the Golan where
for
it
sure.
kind of like gave a little bit of assistance to some of the more moderate rebels there
But their
briefly.
role was
So
so quiet and undocumented, unfortunately. But continue.
yeah, yeah. Well, anyways, I think that it's just very easy, I think, to rally around Hezbollah, and it is politically a good way to like Han said in terms of interacting with the majority government in Lebanon, right?
Hmm.
Where it's just like you have this other kind of southern party who's causing you a lot of problems in your government and all that. So um, I think it's probably just a smart move, both
Yeah.
militarily and in terms of like, getting the kind of the new nationalism in Syria together and just, strategically, politically with Lebanon. I think that's all very straightforward. Meanwhile, if I was them, I would be doing everything I could to normalize with Turkey, with the Kurds, and through them with the US, because
Mm.
they're by far their best option in getting Israel out of the Southwest
Yeah,
is by getting the US to convince them to leave.
of course.
Hmm. Yeah.
I think that that's what they would prefer. And if they have to fight with them head on in the Golan, that's going to be horrifying for everybody. Most importantly, the Druze, and
Right.
the Druze will get left behind. They'll be killed. There'll be information campaigns around them, just like there were with the Alawis in the Northwest. And so it's a very dicey situation down there right now.
Well, in 1967, I think it was actually the Druze that were no, I don't want to say spared, of course, like they were also displaced and attacked. But I
Mm,
think there was a specific order to leave a lot of the Druze where they are.
yeah,
So
yeah. So,
like
so the
history says, like they'll probably make it a Druze state, like as they've been sort of hinting at, like they'll actually expel everyone else and keep it as a Druze protectorate or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard about that. It's a very the Druze is like a whole hour of conversation by itself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's very complex and hard to explain
yeah.
without kind of going through the whole thing and how Druze sided with like Jewish militias in the 1948 Nakba, and that's why a
Mm,
lot of
Yeah.
them now are kind of like, they're like, to use a kind of very crude comparison, I think of them kind of as like Latinos for Trump. Like they're like
Yeah.
the most hardcore Trump supporters you'll
Yes.
ever find
right.
because it's almost like
Interesting.
they kind of have something to prove, and that's kind of what
Right.
the in within occupied Palestine, within
Right.
Israel, those
Yeah.
Jews are these very hard right Zionists.
Mm,
And in Israel, they think of Syrian Druze and Golani Druze and all that like that, but they're
yeah.
absolutely not. They're
Yeah.
not at all.
Most
Even,
citizenship, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well,
Even after 14 years of war, all of that, there's still, I think, maybe because they all used to be laissez-passer, which means they rejected the Israeli passport. Now, as of this January, I just looked this up. It was 1 in 5 Druze, which is nothing. That's still
marginal.
nothing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even after that big huge war, it wasn't like some huge exodus. Like, okay, screw it, we're all Zionists now. They literally were like they were still holding on to like their identity as occupied Syrians
Of
in
course.
addition to being Druze. So I'm very skeptical about this whole story about we're going to set up a Druze state on the border or
Of
whatever.
course. Yeah, absolutely.
But obviously there are some villages and towns and groups down there who perfectly happy accepting Israeli
Hmm.
security support.
Right.
And they just did that super PR visit where they
Yeah.
had some
Yeah.
bus loads go over the border and stuff. So it's very complicated down there. I don't think it would ever become like that level of like separatism,
Right, of course.
but it really pisses me off how much just everybody uses Druze as like these political pawns instead of like
Yeah.
treating them as like a non-monolith and with agency and real security concerns from both sides and all this stuff. So it's a
And
it's
the
a
way that
touchy
everyone
subject for
and
sure.
everyone talks about like the Golan Heights as this football, like just to
Yeah,
get points with, just to say
Golan
like
ball. Yeah,
yeah, like
Yeah.
if you're criticizing anyone but Israel, they'll say, well, what about the Golan Heights? We'll go do something about that. Go liberate the Golan Heights. It's like
mm, yeah,
um
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I was
It,
if I was them, I would not be trying to have a head-on fight with the Israelis right now. That would just be my personal preference.
yeah.
What I think will probably happen is we'll see eventually some like some permanent structures built, and then I think we'll see some kind of cursory fighting, like
Hmm.
mm,
Arabs do a lot with the Israelis, and
Yeah.
then I think we'll see that used as an excuse to have everybody be able to return to their homes. And then the real
mm,
question is what happens with that UN buffer, whatever they call it, the border
Yeah.
zone.
yeah.
That to me is going to be they're going to but also that's a really indefensible spot. There's a reason that the Golan traditionally
Mm.
stops where it does is because it's up on the hill and they have the
Yeah.
water and they can shoot down. So that Jebel Sheikh, in place,
Hmm.
they're going to try and hold that forever. But that
And Mount
that bit
Hermon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the same
Which,
one. Jebel
Oh, I
Sheikh
see.
is Mount Hermon. It's the same
Okay,
thing.
okay.
It, I, anyway, it doesn't. Yeah, on the Mount Hermon one,
Right.
there's it's very defensible. That strip is not at all like it's not a strategic strip in the slightest. So
Hmm.
I'm curious to see what happens there. But and they're gonna keep on trying to scare the Druze and use them as these political pawns and stuff. But in my estimation, eventually what we'll see is some skirmishes, and then the Israelis will go back either to that buffer or actually back to the Golan and then leave it be. But maybe that's wishful thinking. We'll see.
would you would you say part of the calculation on the part of the Syrian government is economic, because at this point we're trying to get a lot of the previous sanctions removed. And I think most people understand Israel is seen as the key to the West. And if you attack Israel, you're much less likely to get sanctions removed, normalize ties with Western governments. Do you think that's a key point of the Syrian calculus at this moment, or it's marginal at best?
Yeah, I mean everything they do right now is economic. I mean, I'm a very,
Hmm.
dialectic, materialist sort of a person, but there's they're thinking about it first and foremost all the time. I think the sanctions are their first concern. It's one of the reasons why a lot of times when for me, I think it's pretty easy right now to see through a whole lot of the disinfo and the attacks and stuff on the Syrian government, because
Hmm.
no matter what, they're not going to try to do some big, broad, horrible atrocity thing, at least until they have an answer on the sanctions. Because if they
Yeah,
do any of that stuff, the sanctions stay and it's game over.
yeah.
So any kind of like deliberate atrocity, if they ever plan to do something like that again, who knows? But for right now, they literally can't. And if they get caught for sure doing just one back to atrocity thing, the sanctions stay and then it's game over and their government won't last. So everything right now, everything is getting those sanctions, because as soon as they can get the sanctions lifted, then they'll really rally the Syrians behind them, and then they'll start to get a really serious influx from Turkey, if nothing else, and normalization starts to happen with other neighbors and blah blah blah. So they can, you're very much right that one of the considerations is they cannot be seen as the aggressor. They just
Hmm.
can't. So if they stand up and they're like, okay, Syria is ours now, and our first course of action is going to be to attack the main U.S. ally in the region, like bar none, gung ho, we're going to take back the Golan or whatever. Like if that was the type of nationalism, like militaristic nationalism they wanted to go for, it would be
Hmm.
game over. They would
Yeah.
immediately like make sure those sanctions are stamped in stone, and then Syrians would fall right back into poverty, just like they were
Hmm.
under Assad.
And I was pushing back a bit when people were saying this during the March 5th attacks that broke out like in violence. People were saying like, "Oh, say goodbye to sanctions. This is so over. We're so over. Syria is so over."
Yeah.
But I honestly think like no, I mean Israel itself like commits so much devastation. It's all on public broadcast for the whole world to see, undeniable, and still it gets the Western stamp of approval. So I think if there was a stamp of approval on the current government, you would see those sanctions lifted and you would see nothing change regardless of that violence. And you kind of see that with the EU because EU is like kind of overlooking it, like because a lot of their constituents are begging them, hey, look out for the Christians in Syria, the minorities in Syria, the Alawites in Syria. There's a huge like campaign of Alawi Turkish Germans who have like gone out to riot against the government for giving their blessing to Jolani after the news that came out that their security forces
Hmm.
were arresting and murdering like innocent people. Um, and so I completely lost my train of thought there for a second. Um,
You were pushing back against the people on March 5th.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
and the refugee
Whatever.
to Germany.
We're going to tie it in how
Yeah,
many
yeah,
people
yeah.
are seeing
Okay,
it.
yeah. So the
Government
in Europe is able to overlook some of it because they just want the refugees gone. Like they just really
Yeah.
want Syrians to flee, and so they're kind of willing to say like, oh no, Syria is safe because they were willing to do that with Assad too.
Yeah.
And so like there is a little bit of that going on. Like there being, you know. There was a Security Council meeting though from the UN. I don't know what ended up happening with that, like Russia and USA.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that was. If it was just condemning the attacks or if it was trying to start some kind of intervention or any. I don't think it was that. But do you guys hear about that? No.
I did hear about it. I just don't know where it went.
Yeah, I don't know that one either. Yeah, okay. So yeah,
Yeah.
like no, I think like the EU is showing that it's willing to overlook a little bit of that, but it's still not full sanctions lifting. And I think that you're right, like in the sense that Israel normalization is really what would get sanctions lifted. Like let's be real, the Abraham Accords was basically the U.S. shopping around to various Arab states and saying, "Hey, we'll lift these economic sanctions if you normalize with Israel." And a bunch of countries did it. You got Morocco, you had Sudan, you had I don't know if Algeria did it. No, I think
Morocco, yeah,
yeah,
Morocco, yeah, Bahrain, yeah,
right.
UAE, yeah, yeah. Well, Paul, I do have a question on that same tangent because in America, I've been recognizing a rhetoric from the Christian nationalist sect of the Republican Party that is very anti-HTS. We saw a lot of propaganda coming out from these sects saying that this is Al-Qaeda butchering Christians in the coastal regions. Do you
Yeah.
find it that this could be a pervasive rhetoric that makes its way all the way up to Trump in the top about Syria, and what ramifications could that have with future relations between the U.S. and Syria?
It's so complicated in America because Trump's a Russian asset. So
Let's be real.
um but you
For
have
real.
this but most people who voted for him like are not like they're still like, oh, to hell with those commies. So it's kind of this game that they're playing where they keep on trying to apologize for Russian stuff, but Americans, I mean, his constituents don't even know where Russia is on a map. So like, it's not he can't take that angle, right? So Trump absolutely benefits from calling them a whole bunch of ruffian head choppers or whatever. And there is definitely like the American. It's very easy to stoke American nationalism, like far right nationalism in particular, by just pointing at a brown person and saying that's a terrorist, and then now
Mm.
Americans won't like that person. So in that sense, sure. But the reality is, I think that Trump doesn't really have a platform based on international geopolitics. He just doesn't.
Mm.
So they'll say stuff, I'm not saying that that stuff isn't important. Like even just the way that people shared these viral misinfo posts from Iran and Russia, all that week that they were fighting in the Northwest, that's really harmful because it's just this casual viral disinformation machine. And so in that sense, when those far right people are like, "Oh yeah, screw these brown terrorists," like it's harmful. It really does hurt. But I also just think in general that Trump is not an internationalist. He's not an interventionist. He cares about He cares about military weapons, munitions
Mhm.
sales and stuff.
Right.
And by
And
by saying he cares, his cabinet cares because he has no clue how any of it works. But
yeah,
yeah,
true. But he
it's
does.
basically just going to be there for like that kind of like, hey, I'm fighting the bad guys, and then just making a lot of corporate interest happy.
With Syria, he does have two interests in his heart. He has Israel as number one, I think, but also number two is Turkey because he has the Trump Tower in Istanbul,
True.
and I think he recently said yeah, like like I fully trust Turkey on Syria, like this is its domain or whatever. Like so I think he recently said something like that. So
Valid.
that's really all his geopolitical machinations are in his head. It's literally just, oh, money. Okay, yeah, then Erdogan can do what he wants.
Yeah,
Um,
that's valid. I believe that.
yeah,
Just give him kickbacks through the Trump Tower in Turkey, and he'll be like, all right, yeah,
for sure.
go SNA, you go do your thing. I don't care.
No emoluments clause investigate. That's another like I don't remember. I don't understand how he's getting away with it, but that's another whole rabbit hole.
Since we
Hmm.
are halfway through, is it okay, Paul, if we transition a little bit to Gaza and Palestine for the second half of the conversation?
Sure, yeah.
So speaking about Trump Tower, obviously, uh, the man repeatedly stated that he wants to make Gaza the Riviera of the Middle East. He wants to put Trump Towers up. He shared the AI video of Gaza with the golden Trump image, all these crazy concepts in Gaza. When Israel started attacking, I believe they started dropping leaflets that said they are carrying out Trump's order, and it's mandatory whether
Mhm.
Gazans like it or not. Do you think in Israel's political calculus they want to see America occupy Gaza? Do you think that's their end goal? Because in my political calculus, I think they, in a settler fascistic government that we currently see, want to annex Israel. They want Gaza to be eventual Israel, kick out the Palestinians. They don't want it to be under America. But do you think that they would be okay with America in the short term having it and eventually transitioning over to Israeli control? Do you think that's their goal at this point, or is there something else going on?
Mm, uh, I think that the question is maybe formulated a little wrong. America already occupies Palestine. It just says that it's Israel.
But
So
but are they
the
headed
Yeah,
towards
the
some kind of conflict here of
between the
one?
two
Yeah,
interests.
I kind
no,
of get it.
the reason is because there's already enough of a legal framework that they could do that without changing too much that's already in
Mhm.
place. So I do think that the valid question there is how much do they want like actual American security forces
Hmm.
doing anything in Gaza?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, and we're seeing kind of a unique situation there. And when I say that, I'm thinking of, the quote unquote rescue operation. They saved 4 people and murdered hundreds of Palestinians, but that was like involved with like the fake pier that they made, and
Right.
then the U.S. military's direct involvement in the that central corridor that they keep taking and losing and retaking and all
That's
that.
very important. Yeah.
Yeah, Nazarene Corridor. Thank you. And those are all that is definitely an increase in U.S. involvement in Gaza that there's not much precedent for.
Mhm.
In terms of like, we're going to let American realtors themselves,
Yeah.
go into a demolished northern Gaza and start building a Riviera? Absolutely not. But the reason that I can say that so confidently is that they don't need to do that. American real estate and Israeli real estate are already so deeply entrenched with each other.
Mm.
It's just like it's just like a different go-between or
There'll be bidding
contractor
wars
or
for sure.
whatever.
There'll be bidding
Yeah.
wars.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no doubt. But there's already so much embezzlement and laundering and cronyism that goes on with
Yeah.
the actual Israeli contractors that there would be
Yeah.
no reason to try and somehow they wouldn't allow it just because that's how their entire economy functions is through that kind of real estate corruption and all that. It's what
But
drives all the West
I
Bank
do
settlements and
see
everything.
I see instances of tension between Israel and USA, like where as soon as there's even any hint that the USA like is trying to rein in Israel in any way, like you see them get immediate backlash and saying like, oh, Israel wants USA to be defeated by terrorists and this and that.
True.
So I do
Yeah.
think like, there is one timeline where they do actually get into some sort of like I don't know, USS Liberty could happen again, and like the USA actually says, okay, like we don't want anything to do with Israel anymore, and I don't know, like Israel goes rogue and befriends China and Russia, but staying on Palestine, um, yeah, I didn't know that Al Jazeera was banned by the Palestinian Authority. I,
Yeah, by the
I
PA.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
that's a new one to me. Although it happened back in January, apparently. I
Yeah.
think like there.
There were crackdowns in Jenin, and then the
Mhm.
PA was not the PA was doing the crackdowns in places
Right.
throughout the bank, and Al Jazeera was reporting on it. They weren't happy. They pulled in Israel. They banned Al Jazeera, and yeah,
Yeah.
That's awful.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it just I, I don't know very many Palestinians personally who are fans of the PA anyway,
Mm,
so it's I mean I'm sure they exist, they must, but I just don't know any personally.
right.
uh and yeah, they did some pretty heinous crackdowns, and they just did exactly what Israel did, which was ban them immediately for reporting that they were doing that. And, I don't know, for me that was I don't freedom of the press, I think, is such a big canary, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
In a coal mine. So
Absolutely.
as soon as you see people revoking that, that's when you know that some really bad shit's about to go down. Um,
Definitely.
so yeah, it's an interesting situation. So yeah, I just read the book. One day everyone will have been against this.
Hmm.
And the author is a Palestinian American refugee and was very critical of Hamas as well, which as many Palestinians are.
Sure.
Um, and they talk about like Hamas and the PA the same way that like Americans might talk about the Republicans and the Democrats, right? Like it's not, oh, are you in love with the Democratic Party? It's like, oh, well, are they the lesser of the two evil to the point
Hmm.
where we can still support them and all this other stuff.
Hmm.
And so it's interesting to kind of hear Palestinians talk about the interplay between Gaza and Hamas and West Bank and PA as like, okay, well, these are our options right now. What if one took over this? What if this took over that?
Yeah.
You know, you know, Zionist, you know, endeavor has done a lot of work to make sure that there's a massive rift between those two parties,
Yep.
encouraging as much money flow between this or that, especially towards corrupt PA authorities. Whatever they can do to make sure that the West Bank and Gaza are not aligned ever. So
Yeah.
I think that was a very villainizing moment for the PA, and really, really kind of cemented a lot of Palestinians' uh, view that if nothing else, at least Hamas actually does stand for Palestinians, even if they do or don't approve of the methods that they use to do that. So,
Yeah. An interesting question on that point. I was recently reading poll data about West Bank versus Gaza Palestinians. West Bank tend to have more sympathies for Hamas, whereas in Gaza, it seems like it trends in the other direction, that they're more sympathetic to the PA or at least non-Hamas factions. What do you think the
that's
reason for that?
interesting.
What do you think the reason for that is? Is it a case of like, oh, we just hate whoever is governing
Grass is
over us?
greener on the
Like,
other side, no matter what.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's so
What do you
interesting.
think?
I would want to read the specifics of that study. Did you know what the
Hmm.
date of it was by any chance?
It was I think 2 months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, yeah, but it was, I mean, within the last year, or if
Yes,
not
it
two
was
years.
after October 7th. Yeah, yeah,
But we don't know if it was really like before or after the crackdown in the West Bank,
exactly.
because like that's kind of my question is like, I mean,
Hmm.
I'm sure it's probably always been true, at least has been for a while, but uh, the I'm not super surprised that West Bank Palestinians would start tending more towards Hamas.
Hmm.
I do know that a lot of the numbers in terms of how Gazans feel about Hamas are kind of all over the place
Yeah.
and very
And
dynamic.
polling
And
and polling is all over the place, like
right, yeah, like
generally.
everything is hard there right
Yeah,
now because of the freaking year and a
for
half of
sure.
genocide they've been subjected to. So
Yeah.
I'm curious about that, but yeah, I don't actually know myself. I guess what I'll say is I'm not surprised at all that West Bank Palestinians more and more are disenfranchised or disenchanted with the PA. That's not surprising
Hmm.
at all.
Hmm.
Um, but in terms of how Gazans as a whole view Hamas right now, that's probably a very complicated uh, question.
Yeah.
So hearing that they would be more sympathetic with the PA, I don't know. Maybe who
Hmm.
knows? You'd have to ask them. I don't want to speak for them, but I would generally speaking, the PA is seen as like the one who's willing to play ball and politic and all this, and
Yeah.
Hamas is seen as the violent resistance. So
Yeah.
There was a
And what?
yeah, go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. Go
No,
ahead,
no,
Hayam.
please,
Go
please,
ahead.
please, Elijah, please,
No, I was just going to ask an interrelated question about
please.
some historically famous factions that don't really have much of a known presence anymore, like the
Right.
PFLP, DFLP. What would you say is the reason for the historical drop off of these organizations, especially in the more socialist Marxist category of Palestinian resistance?
I'm sure Hayan has thoughts about this as well. For me, it's an interesting question. I mean, they are still around, of course.
They, they are.
I think that just the Middle East in general and Arabs in general, Arab factions tend to kind of, wax and wane like that because, Arabs have very long memories. And so over time, you just get these associations of who supported what and all this stuff. And it's the
Hmm.
same way in Syria, and a lot of Syrian factions have baggage associated with, how they interacted with the Assad regime
Yeah.
in Iran and all
He
that.
did. Yeah. Yeah.
They've dropped
So
off in yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. You say.
They haven't been hijacking planes, in my opinion. That's really what made them popular, right? Like,
Yeah,
Yeah. That's what made him
precisely.
known. Yeah.
yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
they just
I
gone
mean, yeah,
defunct, you know.
and I really think that I talk a lot about recruitment. I think that early recruitment is a really deciding factor in basically the entire life cycle of a particular group. And for those groups that started, decades ago or half a century ago or whatever, they had their approach um, to resistance, I think, and it was quite a lot of it was kind of like lashing out. They were very much in a bubble. They were trying a bunch of new things. A lot of it was
Yeah.
very cruel. They had a very, I would say, kind of blunt object approach.
Hmm.
The end of the end of 100 Years War in Palestine, the kind of overview book that Rashid Khalidi wrote,
Mm.
he worked directly with Arafat, and
Hmm.
I always think about his critique of Arafat, which was just Arabs at that time just really had no concept of how to play to Western sentiment. They didn't understand how important it was to,
Hmm.
instead of just being idealistic or having these
Right.
principles, you also had to just do the optics. It's what the Kurds
Yeah.
are so good at. That's
Oh my
that's
God.
Öcalan's big his big genius moment really was just
Yeah,
that he knew how to play to Western sentiment better than almost anybody
definitely.
else in the region. And Arabs suck at that. We're terrible at it because
We're
we're
doing a lot
very
better.
much,
We gotta admit, man, he put on a suit.
but we're
Giovanni putting on a suit
much,
is people don't
much
understand how
better.
much of an actual like that is like they're making fun of it because but look like the Taliban didn't put on suits, you know.
No, yeah, he was just like,
It's
screw
not a
it.
high bar at all in any way. But it's
Yeah,
got to
he was
be
just,
understood within its context, man. Like
yeah,
you can't just dismiss
exactly.
it.
There's social media people. Syria doesn't have the kind of social media prevalence that they have in
Hmm.
Gaza, but they're trying. You see those younger, social media creators in Syria who are like, I speak English and I have a microphone. I'm gonna try and do it. They're
Yeah,
trying. You can see them,
it's
and
beautiful
that's
to
very,
see.
very different from anything that you could ever have seen in the era of like PFOP or PLO
Of
and those people.
course. There was propaganda of
And
the deed, I guess, more. And it was pre 9/11. There was no like nobody checking their bags and
exactly.
stuff.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so I think that you have these some organizations can reimagine themselves very effectively and some can't. And I think the PFLP is not one of those organizations. And so these
Hamas
days
had
they kind of function in like these kind of almost NGO status thing, but it's not real. But they're still a terror group and it's a whole thing.
Hamas had a moment where it put on the suit and it said it's like happy to, be democratic and stuff like that. I don't know what kind of
Acknowledged the two-state solution in their new charter
yeah,
2017. It was considered much more liberal than the
right.
OG. Yeah,
I
focus
don't
more
know
on the
that
colonial language. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think they
I
could have
think
done well if they competed with PA on that front. If they kind of like got their act together, became like al-Nusra to HTS kind of, transitioned in that way.
Yeah.
And then became more like technocratic as the people are throwing around a lot about to describe like
Mm.
HTS and their transformation and their emphasis on infrastructure and building actual institutions and stuff like that. Um, to actually like manage civilian affairs and civil um trash like firefighting like basic civilian services like water, Wi-Fi, basic public utilities, these are the kinds of things that hopefully we're going to see from the new Syrian government like focus on in the coming years. But we're still on
yeah.
Palestine and the resistance, and I wanted to get your opinion on going back to that question of why shouldn't Syria be facing Israel? People were throwing out the idea that, like, look, the Houthis got attacked by Trump recently, and they put a target on their back. They're willing to do that for their Palestinian brothers. Why can't we do that while we're sitting on the border, and we're being occupied by them, like Iran's or Yemen's not being occupied by Israel? What would either of
Yeah,
you say
no.
to that?
I mean, I don't know, Elijah, what do you want to ask? I have an answer, whatever you want.
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Please.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm the first person who just like in a very basic way, like would be if all of a sudden they just started like firing a bunch of rockets, to like get the Israelis out of Syria. That would be great. I think that's fantastic. I do think that the Houthis have been in this kind of infrastructure of resistance for what is it now, like 13 years or something like that. I forget the exact
Yeah,
year,
pretty
but
close to our same as ours. Yeah.
it's roughly around the same time with Saudi, right? So
Yes.
Oh,
I
okay.
want to say it's 2010, but I don't quote me. Anyway, the point is, God, it's 15 years? I don't even know. The idea is they have that all kind of ready to go, and it's all the structure is in place, which is important for those kinds of operations. And it at some point you have to stop apologizing for the new Syrian government and be like,
Mm,
okay, you've had enough time. You need to have a military and you have a process for defending your borders. That just needs to
hmm.
happen.
Of
And so
course.
I think that the real question is just how long do we give them?
Mm,
And it seems to me like they're kind of starting to really come together. But like
hope so.
in terms of time frames, It's like, what interim government for around 5 years, and they want to do
Yeah,
integration of the SDF in 1 year. And that sounds very slow to us. And we're just like,
yeah,
well, a lot of damage can be done
for
in a
sure.
year. A lot of damage can be done in a month, in 4 months at
And
least,
the
So
agreements themselves, not sure how good faith they are either.
of course,
There's
there's
They could
no
be
way to know.
sabotaged halfway. Because look, like the amnesty that we gave to a lot of former Syrian soldiers kind of blew up in our faces because they took advantage of that amnesty to regroup,
Yeah.
form a coup attempt,
yeah,
and start like ambushing and attacking security forces.
Yeah.
yeah,
And then that led to, local militias doing friggin' massacres.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot that has to be considered in these things.
Hmm.
And I I had no interest in engaging with, on December 9th, people being like, well, why aren't they attacking Israel? That's a really
Yeah,
stupid question.
for
yeah,
sure.
But at a
Definitely.
certain point, we have to start considering, like, at this point, you need to do something. You
Hmm.
have to protect your borders, otherwise this is just going to continue to infringe and infringe. So
Yeah,
I don't have the answer to that question, to be honest.
of
In my
course.
head, I just have kind of just like the
What we
throwaway time
want
of
and what
civil.
we think is realistic to demand.
Yeah,
And that's kind of where
yeah,
we are where we are. But I'd love to
yeah.
be in like a fly on the wall in all those meetings going on right now. Like I wish the government was doing better to communicate everything they're thinking, to Syrians because we really want to know, man. Like we're just getting like Twitter tidbits here and there, rumors, this
Mm.
and that, like from Telegram. Freaking, I hate the new media
They
environment
have
that we've created for ourselves with
they have to
everyone.
get their press together. It's a
Yeah.
disaster
And
right
no,
now.
not
It's a
just not just
disaster.
Syrian media, but just media in general. Like we've stopped funding journalism and public broadcasting, and there's just generally
Hmm.
like more hostility towards journalism. That
True.
Telegram has become a main source for a lot of news, I swear.
It's disgusting.
Yeah,
Telegram is the least verifiable news source
for
out there.
sure.
It is a disaster. It's a
Yeah.
disaster.
And it's
And
the
people would kept
infiltrating
telling
the
me, like,
US guys that,
I saw it on Telegram. I saw it on Telegram. Like,
of
from
course.
who? Who
Yeah,
is
yeah.
that?
exactly.
You
Absolutely.
don't know. That's insane. You're an insane person for me sending you like these, like, Al Jazeera, DW, and all these people, and they'd be like, oh no, well, I saw a guy on Telegram I trust way more than these imperial puppets. It's like,
Hmm.
what are you talking about?
But they've
Well, they're really
infiltrated a
good on
lot of
Palestine. It's like, yeah, so is
mm,
Iran.
yeah.
Iran, who still says that COVID was an Israeli plot genetically engineered to target Iranian DNA. Like, they're insane.
oh wow.
And you're trusting them over Al Jazeera.
Yeah, yeah.
It's sorry for the outburst. It's
No,
just
and I'm telling you, it's becoming a pro, and you should be very worried about it because it's in the U.S. Like it's deep in the
Yes.
U.S. too. It's not just
oh,
like
very much
there's a
so.
lot of like mega Telegram chats too.
No,
And there's
there's MAGA Telegram for sure, and it's a problem, very
Yeah.
much a problem.
and they're definitely seeping into each other. I mean, even with the COVID example, it was RFK Jr. who was saying that COVID was genetically engineered not to target Ashkenazi Jews
Oh my
and
Yeah,
God.
Chinese,
yeah.
but other people. So I mean, there's definitely a confluence of all these like like extremist sects on Telegram
Right.
that are influencing each other. In my opinion, I mean, I can't prove it, but I would assume that's
Yeah.
the case. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
100%.
going back briefly to Gaza, I want to touch on the ceasefire. Um, we heard in the media, I mean, at least I'm someone who speaks Hebrew. I know what Netanyahu was saying for a long time that this was not going to be a temporary measure. Or sorry, this was not going to be a permanent measure. It was only going to be temporary. They would go back in and continue fighting. He made that known.
Mm.
Do you think from Trump's side of the political calculus that he also intended for this to be a temporary measure like Netanyahu? Did he want this to go into phase two and then into phase three? Is there? It's going back to our questions of competing interests, but do you think Trump was always aligned with Netanyahu and saying, yeah, phase one, Israel can get some hostages back. They can go back in and quote unquote finish the job like they've always said they would? Or was Trump being authentic and saying, yeah, we'll get a permanent ceasefire up and running?
The only time Trump is being authentic is when his mouth is closed. Other than that, he's pretty much guaranteed lying. Trump has a pattern that is he is always agrees with the last person he talked to. Um,
Mm,
that it's there is no consistent view that he has other than he likes attention and money. Um,
100%.
no.
Israel can get him a lot more attention and money,
Mm,
and most of the people around him side with Israel. And so that means that very consistently, all the time, he will be pro-Israel. and he
Hmm.
will say whatever pro-Israel people around him said most recently. And as long as, he gets attention and money from that, he will have no other view. So, unfortunately, in America, if all you care about is money, you are a Zionist, and that is because America has a ton of economic interest in the success and survival of Israeli and the Zionist occupation, and because they are able to profit from the genocide of Gaza, it will continue under Trump because it gets him accolades and money and attention.
What do you think about the measures Trump did to get Netanyahu to quote unquote even sign or be on board with phase one to his 42-day degree? Because I think I read it was from Anthony Lowenstein that the way Netanyahu agreed to this was that Trump had to remove all the sanctions that the Biden administration imposed on West Bank settlers. They had to remove any sanctions on Israeli spyware. There was, I think, a general increase for Israeli settlement production in the West Bank. How how does that factor into the calculus of Netanyahu? Does he even care about that? Does he care more about the West Bank than Gaza? What's Netanyahu's perspective on all these measures, or is he just viewing it all as a means to an end for the West Bank and Gaza as one big hole that they'll eventually annex?
Yeah. So I was, I mean, very morbidly, but it was an interesting thing that during the ceasefire, quote unquote, where
Yeah.
attacks on Gaza didn't stop but reduced to a crawl, they increased so significantly in the West Bank.
West Bank. Yeah.
It was almost like because Israel really is struggling at this point with like munitions and the sanctions and becoming a pariah and all that. Their economy is not doing well. Tech companies are shutting down, and Netanyahu has very vested interest in guaranteeing his populace, his corporate, you know, cadres that are all involved in this, that he'll be able to continue working as this, and that Trump is basically going to continue what people were worried would end over the last year and a half. I mean, Israelis aren't stupid. They know that they're that the boycotts are having an effect, and that the reputation of Israel and all these companies is tanking, and we probably have a recession coming on. So I
Yeah.
think that he is very, very interested in that stuff, very interested in it, and but his approach is to keep that kind of constant war subsidy coming,
Hmm.
uh, in addition to using it as like something he can show to people to guarantee, like, look, Trump is on our side. We can, if you were not confident before, let that confidence return, because we're back to the old ways, baby, sort of a thing. So
Interesting.
um,
I I think a
that's
lot.
my general
That's
take on it, I think.
That's fair. I think a lot of pundits were saying at the time of the ceasefire that it was in Israel's desire to shift their focus towards annexation of the West Bank, at least Area C of the West Bank, rather than Gaza. And so that was the political
Yeah.
calculus somewhere attributing to Netanyahu in the moment. Do you think that's fair? Because whenever people have spoken about annexation, at least as I conceive of it, the West Bank always took precedence over Gaza. And obviously after
Yeah.
October 7th, maybe that calculus shifted a little bit. Do you think the long-term strategy of immediate action is still the West Bank, even though the genocide has flared back up in Gaza? Do you think annexation of the West Bank is the primary objective of the settler government?
Always, 100%. I think that Gaza is really just show of strength, an act of cruelty,
Hmm.
a checkbox. But the West Bank has always, because I mean, if you are even remotely involved in like the like Israeli real estate events here in America, which I try and keep an eye on,
Yeah.
they're obsessed, obsessed, obsessed with West Bank. But when they talk about Gaza, it's kind of like this, this horrific tongue-in-cheeky thing where they're just like, oh yeah, maybe in who knows how many years when it's livable again, we can build these big apartment complexes or whatever. So the more immediate return by far to them is West Bank, and that is still their big selling point when they try and like, convince settlers to move to Israel or whatever area, is they say come to the West Bank, and they can no longer say come to Gaza in any realistic or immediate sense. So it's always the West Bank. And if anything, I would say that they used to kind of tiptoe around those events. They just kind of tiptoe around like, oh yes, some of these might be in this area in the West Bank or whatever, but they don't do that anymore. It's gotten much more brazen, much more blatant
Hmm.
in the past year or so, I think.
I,
So
I think
I would completely agree with that assessment.
that's fair. I think, and you hit on this in your answer, but I think a lot of people don't understand that most settlers in the West Bank are American Jews. They were Jews who were born and raised in America or Britain, and they speak English. English is their first language, and those are the people who are setting up the most extreme of extreme settlements in the West Bank. And I tie this back into our conversation about Gaza, because in my mind, even in a hypothetical scenario where Trump did occupy Gaza and he set up American patronage and settlements there, the only people who would be moving to Gaza are probably New York and Brooklyn Jews, who are just pretty extreme individuals and extreme Zionists at that point. Um,
Yeah.
but touching,
But
we
that's what
talked,
I'm saying. Like, what's the
yeah,
difference? Like, oh, they're
exactly.
Americans. Well, like, how does it even? It's all Americans. Like,
Exactly. It's the same groups that are doing it in Gaza that would be doing it in the West Bank and vice
yeah,
versa.
100%,
Yeah.
100%.
And so going back briefly to the West Bank, and we talked to a previous guest, Hytham, about this issue. Do you think that most settlement desires are for real estate deals, or do you think there's more of a religious fanatical connection that's driving this? Because that's quote unquote Judea and Samaria to religious Jews, and that's why at least half of them are in the West Bank. I know 50% are roughly economic settlers who are style life, easy cost of living settlers, and the others are actual hardcore fanatical settlers who believe in the project of expansionary Zionism. Do you think that that would be that is going to be the driving impetus for the majority of these settlements coming in the future, or do you think it's going to be a continuation of style, cost of life settlers?
So here's a really interesting question, and I don't have the answer to it.
Yeah,
I've also always heard that half and half. The half of the people there just have like a Jewish grandfather and they're not practicing and all that.
yeah,
And then some section of that remaining other half who are actually practicing Jews are actually doing it for moving to Israel for like fanatical reasons, other than just like, they're just Americans who are practicing Jews and they don't have any problem with what's being done to Palestine. But that's
yeah,
not the same thing as being like a far right Zionist, right?
yeah,
So the question then is, considering now that the world is, if you just take 2 seconds to look at it and are interested in what's actually going on in the truth, it's very easy now to know what Zionism is and the settler colonial project and the Nakba. You can no longer deny it. You can no longer not know about it. You can obviously
yeah.
deny it, but you can't, you see it everywhere now.
Be
And
ignorant
everybody
of the
knows about it.
yeah.
Yeah, you can't be ignorant of it. You can just do the work to deny it in your brain to be okay with living there, however you
Yeah.
want to do that. So the question then is, because of that, your question I think becomes more relevant because quite a lot of people, especially like since the 90s at least, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, who moved to Israel, they just do it for the economic and aesthetic and the
Yeah.
subsidization of life and everything. It's fine. They don't care. Now that like we're seeing this kind of it's on the stage as this horrifying thing. There are fewer justifications for it for the former liberal Zionists, right?
Yeah.
For somebody who was like, oh well, we are indigenous and it is the promised land, and it's sad that these brown terrorists don't want us here, but it is our land, so we have to, blah blah blah. Those people are going to find it harder and harder. They're already finding it harder and harder to excuse it away, and they're going to hesitate to move there. But to what extent has this new, you know, visibility going to encourage those far right Zionists to settle there, to move to Israel,
Mm.
to help ethnic people cleanse it? And nobody knows the answer to that question. I guarantee you that people like Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Vice, Daniela Vice, that all people, they're saying that it will help. They think that it'll help. They think that not only is it going to be more hardcore ultra nationalists moving there for that religious fanaticism, but that
Mm.
those people will be more helpful in terms of the militarism, the training, joining up with the IOF and displacing settlers. So they're going to be arguing that even if those numbers technically don't place the former liberal Zionists who now might think twice about settling in Israel,
Mm.
the people who do move there are going to be more fanatically Zionist and therefore more helpful to the settler colonial project. And I don't
Mm.
have an answer to that question, but I know that they're having that discussion out there right now, and to some extent that might be a valid theory,
Do you think this will lead to
which
the
is
death of?
terrifying, which
It
is
is very terrifying.
terrifying.
It is very terrifying. But some Palestinians have expressed that this kind of activity will lead to the downfall of the state of Israel. They think that
Mm,
the settlements in the West Bank are, first of all, they were one of the biggest impediments to implementing a two-state solution. But the
sure.
project of Zionism as a whole is becoming untenable to the world. And the fact that you now have 800,000 settlers in the West Bank, I think everyone can agree, a two-state solution is not feasible. So
Yeah.
the question is what is next? And so I think that in the Israeli ethos, the only solution, even though if they won't say it openly, they might have platitudes about supporting a two-state solution that they'll never follow up. They know down the line annexation is on the block. Annexation is not feasible unless you have mass amounts of expulsions of Palestinians. Demographically, I think it's 7 million Jews in the land, 7 million Arabs. You have to either expel those Arabs, or I guess you can give them some weird status where they don't vote, but the world will never put up with that. It's if you already denied it being apartheid, you can't deny it at that point. Do
Mm.
you think this process, short of expulsions, I mean, even with expulsions and their status as a pariah already, I think would eliminate them from maybe even US support at that point. Do you think this process will be the downfall of the state of Israel?
Uh, do you?
I, I personally think so. I do believe it will be the
Yeah.
downfall of the state of Israel. I think they will annex. I don't know if they'll get away with expulsions, but I think they'll make Palestinians some weird in-between status where they wouldn't have voting rights. They would be residents or some other concept. But I do believe that there will be a civil rights campaign that the world will get behind to make Palestinians citizens of that state. And if they get voting rights, it's voted out of existence like that. If you're already 50% of the
Yeah.
population, you get one democratic state from the river to the sea where Jews and Arabs are equal representatives of the state. End of story. So I do believe that will be the end of Israel as we know it,
Mm.
personally.
Yeah. I think so too. So the model, there's two states that people always reference in terms of apartheid, and that is South Africa and Rhodesia.
Yeah.
South Africa obviously being the much more well-known one. South Africa apartheid ended, and a bunch of white people left because they didn't want to live there if they couldn't lord over black people as as the on the winning side of an apartheid system. And to this day, they still have this kind of super privileged existence there because they have like this old money and your
Yeah.
emerald mine muskers and all this stuff. Versus Rhodesia, which um, was a much more, it was a smaller but much more heinous, like horrific apartheid
Impressive.
system. It was
Yeah.
even more brutal, which is
Yeah.
not a low bar. Um, and it was barely recognized anyway. It was a pariah for a long time. It was basically people who thought that they were being too nice to black people in South Africa. So
Yeah.
when that one ended, it immediately got renamed, and it was just gone. Like nobody even could point to where Rhodesia was anymore on the map. It's like a distant memory. And
Yeah.
so I think that what will happen in Israel is going to be somewhere between those two examples,
Mm.
but it'll be closer to Rhodesia. I think that at some point it will end, and I think that you know people are always arguing about, well, will it still be called Israel? Will it be called Palestine? I think it's just going to be called Palestine, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think that Israel never quite cemented their status enough. No matter what anybody thinks, I just don't think that they're as sure of a thing as everybody talks about.
Maybe
The
it'll be like
countries.
Burma, Myanmar kind of thing, where it's like one is the official name and the other is the one that a lot of people still name it. I don't
Yeah,
It's a
like I'm sure that
one-state
he
why would
like
it be called Israel at that point? Because it's not a Jewish state anymore. If you annex and everyone has equal citizenship, why would the Jewish name be the name? Palestine is
so
more.
it's
Yeah, yeah,
right. So it's already 50-50, right?
know.
Already it's 50-50, and
Hmm.
50% of those people are on the losing side of the current apartheid.
yeah,
If they get any sort of right of return, it's gonna be more Palestinians. If
yeah.
apartheid ends, a lot of the Jewish people will leave, just like they did
Yeah.
in Southern Africa,
They
right?
lost their
There's
privilege.
absolutely no
Yeah,
way, it's zero
Mm.
chance that
Sure.
I don't think that this a two-state is viable at all. If even if it was, why not do it now? Just do the two-state. Oh, you didn't do the two-state? Okay, fine, then one state. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
there's no conversation to be had here that ends with Israel keeping a majority forever. It just doesn't exist.
Mhm.
So the real question is, what does it look like? How bloody will it be? How many Palestinians have to die? What will it take for the U.S. finally to stop arming them? these are very difficult questions, and the answer to almost all of those is that, well, we're going to murder a lot of Palestinians and see if that works. And when it continues to not work, eventually it'll just collapse. It'll just be not worth supporting anymore. So how long that takes and what it looks like, nobody knows. But I think that that is by far the inevitable conclusion. I'd forget
Yeah.
how many years ago he said it, but there was this one U.S. ambassador who gave it 20 years. That was his prediction.
Mm.
Yeah.
Something like 2015 or something like
Yeah, I
that.
think
He
I heard
said
something
20.
like that too. My dad also says like, by like I was like by do you think by 2060? He's like, no, no, it'll be long gone by then. So I
Yeah.
think yeah, like it's not about a question of like, oh, it'll be like destroyed. It's not, it'll be dissolved sort of hopefully
Yeah.
slowly, and people will have autonomy in their, and like will have
Yeah.
actual like national identity, hopefully in a pan-Levant structure. But I think the key to, I don't know whether that happens through resistance to Israel or if it's like, because South Africa, I guess it just eventually they just ran out of money from the boycotts or something.
That was part of it. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, the end of diplomatic support all around.
So yeah,
Yeah.
whatever is the final nail in the coffin, or so to speak, like I think the key to it is strengthening Syria and Lebanon through that border cooperation of the two states that can actually like get us to have a more united like military infrastructure. And I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Kurds in the last bit of this part as well. We've been integrating the SDF with the Syrian army. Like you said, it's going to be about a year to go for that to happen. And I've heard also that Turkey has appointed a military officer to be its defense attaché in Damascus. So I think there's going to be
Mm.
a lot of military cooperation between Syria and Turkey, and I hope with Lebanon as well. And I think, I think, I have no doubt in my mind that Kurds will play a role in the Syrian army, and they already do. There's already Syrian Kurdish members, but the idea of the SDF integrating is it's going to be like a little more difficult with I don't know, like to tell me your thoughts about that. I personally think like we need Turkish military, not necessarily presence, but like help, like a lot of bolstering of our equipment and intelligence sharing and all this stuff, especially because they're a NATO partner, and like their presence in Syria offers us a much stronger hand against like if Israel were to attack us with Turkish bases present, like that would be much more of a big deal, or you know and so I don't see, and I don't see like I don't see the relationship between Turkey and Syria to be inherently um what is it called? Um coercive. You know what I mean? Like I do
Mm.
think that a lot of it is based on the fact that they were the longest standing ally is a strong word, but they were the ones that, like, I guess you could say, like, betrayed Syrians the least, in that they accepted the most amount of refugees.
They
You know what I
betrayed
mean?
Syria the least. That
You
is
know,
that is incredibly, it's a powerful statement because everybody betrayed Syria, but they betrayed Syria the
everyone
least.
betrayed Syria, and I
So,
think like on one front they were ready and willing to normalize with Assad, no doubt about that. On the other
oh
hand,
yeah.
they were the ones that accepted the most uh backlash for supporting the revolution. Like Erdogan himself, like suffered a lot politically for expending like military resources in Syria, for supporting
Mhm.
like the Islamist terrorists, FSA, because like his opposition obviously used that against him a lot of the time, and it kind of won as a gamble in the end because like he's being celebrated as a hero for doing that. So I don't see it as necessarily like entirely coercive. I think Turkey made a good bet on Syria, and like kind of, you know what I mean? And so there's a lot of appreciation for them, and there's a lot of distrust and kind of seeing the SDF as like, for lack of a better term, like a shit disturber, like a true like kind of throwing monkey in the wrench of the revolution that kind of because no one believed that the Syrian revolution was an Arab revolution or an Islamic revolution. Like no one believed that Syria was just gonna not be for Kurds. Kurds were always like, included, but they weren't gonna be explicitly mentioned. And so the SDF kind of wanted Kurdish like sovereignty to kind of be established and in whatever solution post-Assad. And so that developed into their own kind of politics for a while. They developed their third way model of not being anti-Assad or pro-Assad, but kind of seeing playing their power uh, power games like and just seeing whatever whoever would back them the most. And from my opinion, it took away the opportunity for rebels to be truly US funded because they were willing to fight ISIS without fighting Assad. And so US was like, okay, we'll take you guys rather than rebels who are
Mhm.
willing to fight ISIS and Assad. And so these are the kinds of like challenges that like Syrians view SDF as having caused, while they view like Turkey as having betrayed Syrians to a lot of like their treatment and as refugees in Turkey was not always like met with like sunshine and rainbows. So there's definitely like a love-hate relationship. Some Syrians you speak to, they absolutely hate Turkey. Some Syrians you speak to, they like pray at the altar of Erdogan. Um, and so
Sure.
yeah, that was a long-winded explanation just to sort of put my own thoughts out there, and then if you want to respond to them in any way, and I don't think we'll go back and forth on it too much, but I would love to have your take on how you feel about Turkey's military presence in Syria to bolster our defenses. What you think, how Kurds, specifically pro SDF Kurds, because again, there's a lot of Kurds that are already in the Syrian army in the current administration. They're just not like we don't like write it as a Kurdish like league or something like but
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with that whole assessment. I mean, I think the presence. I mean, right now, Turkey basically kind of, yeah, like you said, they won the gamble,
Mhm.
and they stuck it out. And the question of how much they did that because they thought that it was like a mutually beneficial thing with like with like the Syrian resistance versus how much they really just wanted somebody who would attack the PKK. You know what I mean? Like it's PKK, whoever, whichever version of them they are, whatever.
Hmm.
The 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 interplay there is still a little unknown, I think. I
Okay.
mean, and the my basic take on that is I just really think that the fact that we have to get a lot of our information online really skews how we view the Syrian Kurds in general.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
think that I think that the pro SDF Kurds
Hmm.
are so much louder
Oh yeah.
online, like the pro
Yeah.
Rojava, the
Yeah.
pro whatever.
And
I think there's
oftentimes they're not
so
Syrian. They're not like it's a lot of times
They're
they're Rojahilat, like Iranian Kurds or
yeah,
Bakur
yeah.
Kurds or or Iraqi
Oh,
Kurds.
absolutely. And as,
Yeah.
as a matter of fact, you can almost tell like it's like an exact equal sign when the fighting in the Alui cor uh, coast
Sahel,
was
yeah. Sahel. Okay.
happening. Uh, Whenever you were like tracing one bit of misinformation or whatever, which was just all over the
Mm.
place, which like where'd it come from, where'd it come from, where'd it come from,
Mm.
9 times out of 10, it would lead to Iran, or maybe 8 times out of 10. One time out
Mm.
of 10, it was Russia. And then the
Yeah.
last, it was Kurdish. And if it
Mm.
led to some Kurdish website, it was exactly an equal sign if that Kurdish website was either Iranian or Iraqi Kurds, not
Mm.
Syrian Kurds.
For
It
sure.
would it would talk about Rojava and all that stuff, but
Yeah.
they were not it was not actually run by a Syrian Kurd. It
Exactly.
would Do you know what I mean? And it was just such a fascinating parallel. The only other one I saw is there was like one or two Armenian
Yeah.
social media sites that were, and I'm pretty sure it was somehow connected to like an Iranian outlet or something, which is
Well,
common.
no, I
So
mean, because Armenia is like, sorry, just really quick to touch on that. Turkey's media infrastructure, a lot of its opposition is Greek, Armenian, and Kurdish. Like, to just to, let's just to be frank, like, there's Gersek News, there's different
yeah,
platforms. But yeah, sorry.
That's
yeah, exactly. So I mean, because it's just geographic. Anyway, so that's exactly right. And it was like, oh, I wasn't sure if that was run by like an Iranian Kurd, but now
Hmm.
I know because they're doing this crap where they're spreading this fake video
Definitely.
from 2014,
Yeah.
like they shared on the Middle East Spectator or whatever that
Right.
Iranian rag is. And it was just like it was all like, this makes sense. Now I know which type of Kurdish so-called autonomy social media
Well,
account
yeah,
this
and
is.
so
It's
and
very
part of SDF is like with
direct.
the revolution and fine with their reconciliation with the new government, and so like some of them view it as a total betrayal. And I think the biggest like
Yeah.
pushback is pro-Iranian SDF supporters who,
Hmm.
they're sabotaging efforts to reconcile. There's still Syrians being arrested for carrying the green flag in SDF areas despite the reconciliation. There's still kids being kidnapped, like on their way to school and stuff to be recruited
Hmm.
into the SDF. Like it's awful. And I hope maybe we can speak about it again sometime where there's way better news to report on. But
Yeah.
unless you had any other final thoughts that you wanted to share with us, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Paul. Sorry we delayed this on you a couple times, but
It's
yeah, it
fine.
was well worth it in the end. And yeah, if any thoughts you wanted to end up on.
I think my something that I just think that we need to be focusing on unity right now,
100%.
as Syrians, and it sounds like some saccharine stupid thing, but no, I literally mean like the borders. We need
Oh,
to be focusing on a unified Syria,
mhm, of
and we need to include that when we talk about Kurds of the Northeast or Afrin
course.
or ez-Zor or the Golan
Yeah.
or the coast. It doesn't matter. I really think people just need to remember that what we're fighting for is a unified Syria, and that
Yeah.
almost every Syrian is fighting for the same thing, no matter how loud some small group of mostly non-Syrian Kurds are saying, "Oh, we're going to separate and form our own state," which is absolutely not going to happen. There's no way that state would survive. I don't care if they have a couple oil fields in the Euphrates. It's not a viable state.
Hmm.
Same thing goes for some sort of buffer state in the Southwest. That Druze state, I mean, maybe people think because it's butted up against the Golan, maybe, but no, these are not viable things. So,
Yeah.
and the more people talk like they are, then the more people just argue about it online, and it
Well,
just muddies the waters.
but like then again, like it's okay to say Kurdistan, free Kurdistan. I understand that. It's like saying free Levant or free Mesopotamia. Like I don't know.
Of
I guess I
course,
see them more as like imaginary communities that hopefully one day we can aspire to like unite on some basis for. But for now, like and although Syria is a colonial invention, unless we're literally
a lot
deconstructing
of
the modern nation state, like I don't see us going away
yeah,
from the model of
yeah,
Syria
yeah.
anytime
The the
soon.
the
And it's
borders
not like it's
are what
called
they are.
Arabistan
I
either,
mean,
right? Sorry, go ahead.
yeah.
no, I mean, of course, that free Kurdistan, of course, and that doesn't mean create a separate state. Like the four
Exactly.
quarters of Kurdistan don't even like each other at this point. What we're saying is Kurds in that region need to have freedom and
Language rights.
equality
And
and
yeah,
and dignity and be able to teach their kids in the language that they want to
absolutely.
teach and
And
dance and
citizenship,
do,
which Assad
of
deprived them
course,
of. Of course, absolutely.
Well,
which Assad deprived them of, and which Shara and his government say that they're going to have. So
Hopefully.
these are all, these are all good signs, and I'm going to
Absolutely.
continue to hold on to the good signs, and I'm not
For
going to
sure.
be like these doom and gloom and stop doing my fact checking when something is like, finally it's collapsing. Like, no, it's actually not. You're just
Right.
not correct. So
Yeah, a lot of our enemies, they just wish for our downfall so
yeah,
much that they
stop
forget
being
to,
so excited at
yeah,
the imagined idea of a fracturing, collapsing Syria,
for sure.
and be realistic with your critique. We have critiqued
Absolutely.
quite a few things about the new government in this
Absolutely.
conversation, but that's been informed critique, not
Absolutely.
panic. You know what I mean?
Right.
So just be unified, discuss things, do your fact checking. That's all I want to say. Thanks for
Free
coming to my
Levant.
TED talk.